Welcome. Today's post is, Post-Durham, the G7 Transition. Published on May 23, 2023. John Durham was appointed on October 28, 2017, the same day as Q's first post, and Durham's investigation just ended. It's a big deal. But what does it mean specifically? Here are the topics we'll be decoding today. You can always find this list in the description below. If you enjoy this video, please press the like button, and subscribe for weekly full-length blog posts, and shorter, more shareable videos. Let's begin. This last week saw the official end of the Durham investigation. At a glance it appears to have been a dud. Durham, then and now. Durham's investigation was the single most important thing to watch for anyone following Q closely. Q made it clear that the existence of Q was tied to the Durham investigation. October 28, 2017, Durham appointed. October 28, 2017, Q's first post. Why so much hype for so long over nothing? Was it nothing? This is like most I go over, something where the official narrative we see and the comms underneath tell different stories. I don't think the report itself is what is good. It's always been about what's going on behind the scenes. When Q left at the end of 2020, the last few posts were tied to Durham. The final post was a link to an election fraud video the day after the election. This was also the day the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement. If you've been following my posts, you know decodes make it clear that letting Biden in was part of the plan. If that sounds strange to you, I'll give you a quick primer. Returning to the start of Q, remember the context then. Savior of the world, most expensive painting ever bought by Saudi Arabia. Same guy holding an orb that looks just like it with Trump. This was just before the Saudi Arabia raid that took Al-Walid. The guy behind the Obama/Biden campaign. Literally behind Obama, as in he funded his college and picked the cabinet. And based on my decoding even picked his middle name. That is the context for when Q started. The symbol tied to Durham here was Washington crossing the Delaware on Durham boats. Biden equals Delaware. I don't think this means Biden was intended to be POTUS all the way back in 2017, but I do think when Al-Walid was taken out and Salman was befriended, it meant the strings to Joe Biden were firmly in the hands of the US military. This is why Biden has been sending comms tied to a global coordination that Trump clearly began. September 26, 2020. Joe Biden, I got to the Senate 180 years ago. Plus 180 days equals March 25, 2021. March 25, 2021. Joe Biden, when I came to the US Senate 120 years ago. March 25, 2021. Olympic torch begins its 121-day journey around Japan starting at the nuclear disaster site. Plus 120 days equals July 23, 2021. Japan Olympic torch passing event ends. July 22, 2021. Joe Biden, way back 150 years ago when I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. July 23, 2021. Tokyo Olympics start. Japan is 16 hours ahead of the USA, so for Japan it was already July 23 when Biden said it. August 8, 2021. Tokyo Olympics end. Plus 180 days equals February 4, 2022. February 4, 2022. China Olympics start. All of those gaps are timed to one another as countdowns. It's tied to the coordination all around the world tied to coronavirus. Japan and China coordination are where it led, so comms tied to these two players are critical. Update, G7 Hiroshima nuclear site. Right now G7 is finishing up in Hiroshima. The original nuclear disaster city. Reconcile with the Tokyo Olympics beginning in nuclear disaster site Fukushima. If you haven't read my nuclear decodes, I strongly suggest doing so now. The short explanation is Hiroshima was firebombed to cinders, but that nuke was something different. It symbolized a use of blackmail to remove powerful people. Notice Hiram Johnson was reported dead the same day. In World War II, the first nuke represented taking out the people that were preventing action on Japan. It also led to the mass invasion of Russia in Manchuria to force Japan's surrender. This was the symbol of the second nuclear bomb. This is particularly meaningful now. What is Russia doing now? It is invoked now because that's the same kind of Pandora's box to be opened. May 19, 2023, Russia warns of radioactive cloud heading towards Western Europe. May 21, 2023, Ukraine Zelensky compares Bakhmut destruction to Hiroshima. May 21, 2023, Zelensky secures fresh U.S. military aid. Notice the 2018 G7 comms. June 9, 2018, Grimes handcuff position plus gas mask, Demon Souls. June 9, 2018, G7 summit conclusion after eruptions between US and key allies. Don't forget who Grimes was with at this time. August 15, 2019, Musk plus Hammer, nuke Mars. August 15, 2019, Maxwell spotted at In-N-Out Burger after Epstein death with book on deaths of CIA agents. This was when the Corona ops were being prepared. Once again, check my Corona decodes on those if any of this is confusing. It happened to defuse hostage situations. Think Waco. An agreement was reached and then every major military in the world began cooperating to that end. All done without the understanding of 99% of its members. If you understand comms by now, you know how that's possible. Prominent news story this time about G7. The leaders are unsure whether to wave goodbye to people. Which I take to symbolize the uncertainty on whether a lack of cooperation will force extreme measures. But to truly understand what's going on, we need to understand history. There's a long history with the G7/G6/G8. The control over who holds this explosive data is one of the biggest subjects in comms. Chernobyl and Fukushima are both symbols of this. May 4, 1986, G7 Summit Tokyo, Japan. May 4, 1986, Chernobyl containment begins. May 6, 1986, G7 Summit ends. May 6, 1986, Chernobyl containment ends. What specifically did Chernobyl symbolize? Let's see what lines up. Studio 54, DOE. April 26, 1977, Studio 54 opening night. April 26, 1986, Chernobyl disaster date. 04//1986 Studio 54 closing night. Studio 54 was the most famous place that has ever existed tied to celebrities plus sex plus illegal acts. As in obvious blackmail operations. Moreover, much like Chernobyl, there was a famous leak and it was to authorities. Money/drugs/tapes seized by police and the owners would point the finger at other establishments to get a reduced sentence. What entities ran Studio 54? That part is clear. Russia plus Mossad at least. This is clear from the multiple matching dates of Chernobyl to Studio 54. April 26, 1977, Studio 54 opening night. September 26, 1977, Chernobyl commissioned. April 26, 1986, Chernobyl disaster date. 04//1986 Studio 54 closing night. Studio 54 closed down at the same time as the Chernobyl disaster, possibly the same day, and it was timed on April 26, which is when Studio 54 opened in 1977. Which is also the same year Chernobyl was commissioned. Notice he died in Israel, buried in Moses, which lends to the Mossad connection potentially. Founded by ruble. Ruble like the Russian ruble currency. This is speculative as name comms can be easy to misinterpret. Jewish plus military intelligence background, so at least that part is clear. Mob ties of the other co-owner. Max the Jew, gambling boss in Brooklyn. The kind of background necessary to work with blackmail and comms. Runs through the mob, but how do things get funded? These wide-scale Mossad or CIA or KGB ops are funded by a cooperation in markets. May 17, 1977, Likud, Netanyahu, wins first victory over left wing in over 30 years. May 17, 1977. Atari founder Bushnell starts Chuck E. Cheese, gaming/robot franchise. May 18, 1977. DOE passed Senate. Studio 54 closing in 1986 after the raids and leaking meant the ops responsibility went to Japan. They were already involved. Atari itself is a Japanese word and ties into blackmail comms as I go into in this post. May 3, 1986. Silver Dollar City, Tennessee reopens as Dollywood theme park. May 4, 1986. Chernobyl contained. Chernobyl is famous for the theme park that opened the day of the disaster. Dolly Parton, no trap. Symbol of safeguarding from police action. The official thing that finished off Studio 54 was the lawsuits. A number of them, but I'll just discuss this one for the moment. Seattle Supersonics guard filing $20 million lawsuit against Studio 54. As a comm, this is interesting as I suspect it is a message on the shutdown. Historically, Seattle has always been tied to Japan as the primary port for goods into the USA. It is perhaps for this reason that comms tied to Japan are often relayed through Seattle news. I'm not saying that's what this is, but this was right as Nintendo went from an unknown entity in America to the biggest toy multiple years in a row. Nintendo picked up the position of market leader after Atari, and I believe the support given to attain that position in the form of media/market/bank/tech help came with the price of taking over for Studio 54. This is more than just about blackmail though. The surveillance storage also covers darker things. December 13, 1978. Police search triggered due to John Wayne Gacy's denials led to exposure of mass murders. December 14, 1978. IRS agents raid Studio 54. Gacy was arrested later that month, having killed 33 young men and teenage boys. Monsters like this have something in common with blackmail targets, which is in both cases they are kept under heavy observation and recording. Monsters are created and unleashed, and the question of what to do with the footage of those monsters is a big one. The one thing that could put a noose around the neck of the people responsible, obviously you'd want to keep it somewhere it could never be retrieved by local authorities. This is why the need arose to keep it all overseas. Notice Cher mentioned as a regular, a figure I've shown in various posts as tied to both Chernobyl as well as the tech revolution in recording. June 7, 1965. Sony and Cher breakout hit recorded, I Got You Babe. June 7, 1965. Sony introduces its home videotape recorder. Betamax, much like Atari, was run out of the market in the USA. I believe this is because the same entities were tied to the Studio 54 side. That makes it partly Japanese, but then I already stated Atari is a Japanese word. It's not that Japan wasn't involved, it's the factions in Japan that changed as well as the location of storage. I believe Studio 54 was partially the face of ops, much like a celebrity often is. At the very least it was a blackmail hub. This is clear because when I looked at what happened after the closure, the remaining co-founders set up hotel after hotel. The quintessential blackmail environment. Thus Studio 54 being a discotheques, pronounced disco plus tech, was much like Atari being the first mass-market gaming console. It was meant to represent the new tech push as they attempted to integrate it into the connected blackmail pushes. This is a lesson to reconcile with my AI decodes. A methodology where established symbols are adapted to changes in environment. The control over blackmail and MK surveillance is tied to tech, as that's just the nature of cameras and computers. Moreover, I can demonstrate the connection in an entirely different way. You may have noticed in the articles about Studio 54 some talk about a brief revival in the 1990s. Well, what did Atari do then? April 1996. Short-lived Atari 64 revival through Jaguar, Cat, ends. May 1996. Short-lived Studio 54 revival through Cat ends. Notice the people behind the Studio 54 revival was named Cat. Notice Atari's revival was literally a cat. It's also worth noting the studio was turned into a virtual reality game. Which is of particular note because Nintendo had just crashed with the Virtual Boy a few months before this. December 22, 1995, Virtual Boy cancelled after only 6 months on market. The Virtual Boy had literally just killed the entire VR market, and Studio 54 decides that it's the perfect environment to go big into VR. Of course, it's big money in gaming, but much like sports, it exists as a messaging device for the ops going on around the world. This is why, even more than the owners, it is the most prominent guests tied to Studio 54 that would be tied to the logistics of these ops. Calvin Klein, for example. Calvin Klein, famous for using a child named Shields in a sexual photo shoot. The collection of the material. A girl that became famous with the film The Blue Lagoon. A film I decoded in a few ways. One of them about the plot device that Erida, sleeping berries. The connection I made in that post was about the blackmail ops that involved sedation. Symbol of Japanese breakables, something to symbolize a fragile child. I connected this to Teddy Roosevelt and Japan ops. I talked about how Erida equals Atari as a symbol and represented the things going on behind the scenes. This week I found 2 big new connections that both clarify and reinforce. The first of which is reinforcing the Erida comms. Remember, I connected Japanese porcelain to Teddy Roosevelt. This week I was looking over famous movie openings for decoding purposes, and I found this. Famous movie opening where Mark Zuckerberg talks is obsessed about getting into a secret club. A major point of the conversation is how Teddy Roosevelt became president because he was part of the Porcelain Club. An obvious symbol of porcelain. In fact, if you search the term you'll get both results, as it's that close. But I can confirm it even further. Porcelain Club began the very first year American ships went to Japan for the first time. That confirms the Japanese connection, and the use of coding reinforces the practice. It gives a strong indication of what they were interested in. As in, Japan likely had looser taboos than outside territories. I say that partly because the age of consent is 13 years old today. So given this, what the heck was the consent back then? Probably non-existent. This strongly reinforces my decodes about Teddy Roosevelt. A heavy in comms movie about Facebook had a famous opening scene where the topic of conversation was how to join secret societies. The solution given was to join a club and then give comms, making it clear it was tied to child perversion. These realities were maintained. Don't forget the South Park comms that reinforced the Teddy Roosevelt as a child predator. Teddy Bear 1902. Same month of Peter Pan origin. Another story I've shown has the same kinds of child sedation ops. That's a new find as well this week. Another big new find. If you read my last post you surely recall the Stanley decode. The Stanley Hotel, which was adapted into the Overlook Hotel as the cursed hotel in The Shining. July 4, 1909, Stanley Hotel/Overlook Hotel opened. July 4, 1909, Me6 founded Five Eyes. There's a lot more to it than that, but the point is, Stanley, as a symbol, was tied to the MK surveillance, Overlook, ops. 1977, just before Studio 54 opened, and he became a regular. What was Calvin Klein doing? January 28, 1977, Shining book released, Stanley Hotel. January 28, 1977, Calvin Klein hires Stanley and demands full control over product. Symbolism of taking over the Stanley ops. This fell apart when Studio 54/Atari did. The following day legislation was introduced. January 28, 1977, Shining book released, Stanley Hotel. January 28, 1977, Calvin Klein hires Stanley and demands full control over product. February 1, 1977, Ethics in Government Act introduced. Ethics in Government. This was a response to Watergate and would be what brought down Studio 54 after the owners made accusations against Carter's chief of staff. It streamlined the process necessary to investigate officials. 1987 Full House, debut of Olsen twins. 1988 Ethics in Government Act vs. Teddy Olsen. So many of these famous shows are markers like this. Studio 54, Ed Sullivan Building. Before Studio 54, the location was the most prominent television studio for CBS. Even before that, it was an opera house. Opera comms were the precursor to movie/TV comms, so the history of creating stars goes back about as far as it could go. Farther back than TV itself. What were the comms when CBS got it? August 9, 21/1942 Bambi UK/US release date. August 19, 1949, Studio 54 obtained by CBS. Disney's film about the DOE that watches over the forest with his rabbit friend. Notice the original story is by a Felix, this is an important name. October 16, 1923, Walt Disney founded. October 16, 1923, Alice in Wonderland series begins. Walt Disney with Felix. November 15, 1923, KGB first run by a man named Felix. KGB origins. Which is tied to blackmail even without me decoding anything. This helps explain the origins of DOE as it relates to secrecy. The Bambi story, about a deer watching over the forest, parallels the Stanley Overlook Hotel. Often famous deaths are used to send messages, like say the end of one system and the beginning of another. When did the system of Bambi die? Same day the Big 8 studios went to court over the monopoly. Same situation that fundamentally changed Hollywood. The right to control the movies. Stars are blackmailed to attach control, but where are stars created publicly? The answer long ago was CBS's Ed Sullivan. The man who gave the debut to Michael Jackson, US debut of the Beatles, many more. Movies create stars, but shows like these created the interest. One of the most famous parts of Studio 51's Ed Sullivan is how it was cancelled with no warning. March 28, 1971, final episode Ed Sullivan Show. March 28, 1971, Ping Pong Diplomacy Nixon/Mao starts. March 26, 1971, Fukushima nuclear plant begins operation. Nixon went from a landslide victory to the most hated man in the world soon after. 1971 Nixon plus Mao ping pong. 1974 Nixon removed. 1976 Mao removed. Mao suddenly died too, and his wife and followers arrested in an overthrow. This was after getting unlucky and having an earthquake that killed 242,000 people minimum. Clearly there was a disagreement and Studio 54 was the aftermath. Patching up the relationship after a mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people. All to control the country. The disagreement was about Bretton Woods. The ping pong push was preparing the public appetite for pong, which would begin the tech revolution. They knew it was coming and the US plus Japan were cooperating to usher it in. The important part for Studio 54 is how the stars gathered around it. Michael Jackson went from Ed Sullivan straight to the discotheque. Studio 51 was the first CBS television property, and it was likely purchased for the debut of the Ed Sullivan Show. This makes Ed Sullivan the original CBS TV star. For him to be the origin of Michael Jackson's exposure among other stars makes his sudden cancellation a sign. The debut gives a big clue on the nature of this. Note the first Ed Sullivan Show headlined Martin and Lewis. April 3, 1949, debut of Martin and Lewis Show with Bob Hope. April 4, 1949, NATO Treaty. Symbol of international partnership. Their relationship in the public eye allowing for a discussion between the international parties. Airing disagreements and eventually cancelling partnership outright. The final episode of Ed Sullivan I went over, but actually that was the final, new episode. They played reruns until June 6. Final rerun of Ed Sullivan was on June 6, 1971. June 6, 1971, final Ed Sullivan, Bridge over Troubled Water. June 6, 1971, John Lennon/Yoko Ono performing King Kong. Bridge Over Troubled Water. That was the final album for Simon and Garfunkel, which likely means it was another Mossad/CIA partnership. Messages being sent of disagreement and discontent. Ed Sullivan was replaced by Howard Cosell. His show was called Saturday Night Live. January 17, 1976. Final Saturday Night Live with Howard Cosell. January 17, 1976. Saturday Night Live, first season, Blues Brothers debut as King Bees. They took the Saturday Night Live name after this date. Blues Brothers comms are covered in this post. The very first official Blues Brothers skit involves the B band in B suits where he sings about finding a married woman and cheating. Then collapses. So these were timed to the removal of the King, the star maker that replaced Ed Sullivan. That Sullivan studio would later play a role as the venue for Who Takes Over Johnny Carson. Letterman who Carson wanted and the studio's pick of Leno. But that's another topic I'll probably get into in another post. Part of the issue was the handling of tech. Atari went big in 1977 alongside Studio 54, and when it closed down Atari also died. Note the story about there being secret millions hidden in the ceiling, which he laughs off as nothing but quarters, i.e. arcade money. Then the police became a big problem, and they accused Jordan, the White House chief of staff under Carter. The relationship had been repaired only briefly but then fractured again. Anyway, after the collapse they went into hotels. The safer and proven blackmailing environment. Prominent people like Calvin Klein moved into places like Trump Tower. Trump was at the debut of Studio 54. I go over that history in a bunch of posts. Notice he was never seen dancing, which given I suspect that is a symbol for sex makes it clear why tapes of him have never appeared. The moving of material to Japan post-Studio 51 meant the ops that supported Atari would switch to Nintendo and other entities there. That's the payment of sorts for the efforts. February 2, 1980. FBI's undercover bribery investigation implicates Senator and 7 members of House and 31 public officials. February 4, 1980. Studio 54's first major closure, founders head to jail. February 4, 1980. Dr. Slump begins, Dragon Ball origin. Keep in mind how dangerous it is to keep blackmail locally. The FBI raids proved the point on why it needed to move. Though there are other levels to this. One major connection I'm still digging into is how the Berlin Wall fits into things. It's clearly connected to the Soviet ties to blackmail. What did it symbolize? June 20, 1948. Ed Sullivan Show begins. June 24, 1948. Soviet Berlin blockade, leads to Berlin Wall. Was it a disagreement of KGB as CIA/Mossad cooperated? I'll go into this soon. The wall's removal was timed to Russia joining up with Nintendo. Reconcile Tetris with the Berlin Wall. 1989 November, Tetris, Russian wall game, released for Nintendo. 1989 November, Berlin Wall falls. These connections are likely in the right direction. But I need to get things more clear before I make that post. The fact that E.T. killed Atari in particular. A symbol for it as that film with unmarked shelled Reese's Pieces represented the kinds of data to move where the law can't get them. May 5, 1949. CBS Studio 52 first TV series produced with the voice of Disney's Jiminy Cricket. May 12, 1949. Berlin blockade ends. These Berlin Wall comms aren't strong connections, so don't lump them in with most of this post. I'm just trying some puzzle pieces. I've wondered if perhaps it was optics for bigger war budgets, but I don't want to commit to that without finding a lot more. Anyway, let's move on. One thing is clear. The nuclear comms are tied to the creation of puppet networks. June 26, 1954. Junior morning show, Jim Henson begins his famous puppet career with a French rat. June 26, 1954. First nuclear plant commissioned Obninsk nuclear power plant. First grid connection of nuclear. Which explains the Kermit/Homer connection. May 9, 1955, Kermit the Frog introduced. May 10, 1955, Homer Simpson official birthdate. Simpsons comms tie into the MK Ops and computer surveillance. Lisa, computer. 1976, first Apple Mac released $666.66. 1978, Steve Jobs' daughter Lisa Brennan born. 1978, Apple Lisa project begins. Plus 9 years. 1987, Steve Jobs acknowledges for the first time Lisa is his 9-year-old daughter. 1987, Simpsons premieres with Lisa Simpson as the smart 8-year-old daughter of a nuclear power plant worker. Steve Jobs got his start in Atari. These people act as faces for groups of people behind them. The control over major assets and reservoirs of data. Old VHS tapes. I'll come back to those near the end of the post. March 10, 1969, Godfather first published. March 10, 1969, I Am Curious banned erotic movie about blackmail storage top box office draw for 2 weeks due to Johnny Carson and other celebs seeing. But it was Godfather 2. December 12, 1974, Jimmy Carter announces candidacy for POTUS. December 12, 1974, Godfather Part 2 released. The point being moving the blackmail material. Which is what happened in 1977 with Studio 54. Next, I want to go back to present day, as there have been some comms in pop culture that may just give us an update on what's been going on with Durham. Durham Update 2, Breath on wiretaps. Durham as an investigation was a big deal, and so its release would demand comms long time to it. What was the biggest pop culture release that day? Something Japan related? May 12, 2023, Durham Report released. May 12, 2023, Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. Unrelated? If not, what could it mean? Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is a sequel to Breath of the Wild. A game released March 3, 2017. What famous tweet did Trump send right after this? March 3, 2017, Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. March 4, 2017, Trump's famous wires tapped tweet creates media firestorm. A tweet directly tied to the investigation of Trump in relation to Russia. This accusation was built on the back of Mark Levin's investigation. The NYT itself reported on wiretapped data being used to examine Russian ties. Read carefully. February 13, 2022, Durham motion alleges Trump Tower, wiretapping, Mark Levin discovered in 2017, real insurrection, Trump has taken a victory lap that the Durham filing proves indisputable evidence that my campaign and presidency were spied. How does this connect to a Nintendo game? What symbolism is there in a breath? January 22, 2013, Likud Party retakes Israel. January 23, 2013, Zelda, Breath of the Wild announced. December 30, 2015, Obama wiretapped Likud Israeli PM. Define breath in relation to wiretapping. Wiretapping involves recording a breath and using it as a weapon against them. This also means Breath of the Wild, as it was officially inspired by Skyrim, and the unique mechanic of that game involved a weapon of using a dragon's breath, was likely symbolic of the same. This is reinforced by the fact in the new game it involves Zelda and the villain turning into dragons in the final fight. Dragon is symbolic of many people working as one. You could call the people under Soros the body and Soros the head of a dragon. In Skyrim, you learn the voice of dragons and then use it to attack. Reconcile with recording someone's voice and then using it to attack. I have only connected the symbols so far, and none of this explains intent. Nor does it explain what this means for what comes next. A large part of the story involves finding memories made of dragon tears. This could symbolize digging up evidence. The wiretapping of Mossad tying to Trump fits given my decodes tying the two together. This is a foregone conclusion really because both political parties are controlled. One by CIA, left wing, and the other by Mossad, right wing. Thus to gain support for the right wing it is only natural Trump had them as an ally. This does not make him their puppet. Let's not forget this Julian Assange message. November 2017, is there a word for what has happened in the United States? Where the puppet takes over the hand? This is because Trump was supposed to lose, something Mossad had agreed to, but Trump plus US military had other ideas. Nintendo has been sending positive comms the past few years. So I'm sure this new game is a good symbol. The old symbol is less clear to me, as I suspect before 2016 Nintendo, like the rest, assumed HRC would win and were sending comms supporting who they assumed would rule with that mindset. Or at the very least not making enemies. I suspect the original use of Ganon as the villain was to represent the terrorist elements of the CIA. Turns out a famous CIA agent named Ganon was on board the terrorist-bombed Pan Am 103. The flight that bankrupted Pan Am. His luggage was the only one to never be found. Defining an evil that takes over kingdoms, and connecting him with a CIA agent that died under suspicious circumstances. 10 times the CIA helped overthrow a foreign government. Pan Am was the biggest international air carrier for most of the last 100 years. They introduced most everything that is now standard in airline travel, as the list below shows. Given there are entire countries that make less than what Pan Am was pulling in. Simply means the takeover of a massive thing like Pan Am is akin to taking over a kingdom. This doesn't mean Nintendo comms were inherently good, only that whatever it is they were doing, they felt the evil of Ganon was a justification for it. New game story involves cleaning the water supply. Water is an information comm. Link also helps the brainwashed see reason. Then the brainwashed, once they see clearly, helps in the fight. Here's another connection tying the game with the Durham ops. December 7, 2017, Zelda Breath of the Wild DLC. December 7, 2017, question puppets going wild. Notice the context is about rings used to symbolize control of one person over another. I bring up the rings because that's the primary story push of Tears of the Kingdom. Gaining rings which are used as symbolic contracts in the game as a pledge of loyalty. Though the main thing I was pointing out was simply the use of the word wild being timed to it. I doubt that's coincidence. It's nice to see this ring equals cooperation symbol so blunt. This is how one creates a dragon, after all. Even does it with a demonic-looking hand. I'm reminded of the posts where Q talked about how things would come out eventually. These ops have long been prepared. Durham's report is filed and can now be used in other cases. Update, War plus Hammer. Durham's report is filed and can now be used in other cases. This might be why this week I've seen comms about people getting the death sentence. Except for people who, those people get let go. Likened to people who are caught in a saw trap and don't deserve death as a judgment. This fits all my decodes which place people as cooperating with evil only to protect their family. Critically though, the choice is a message. Rats go free, but people who stick with the evil do not. The sequence with the guillotine begins with a talk about candles and tying them to a theoretical massage parlor technique. I've never decoded a candle before, but I am fairly sure I know the context of the massage. Remember, the targets are people who are controlled by blackmail. What is one of the most prominent ways that happens? December 7, 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell accuser said she was paid to give Jeffrey Epstein sexual massages as a 14-year-old. This is strongly reinforced by a comm on their sister channel about games. Episode released within a day of each other, this is in spite of posts often being months apart. Game that begins with a walk to death row and a chance for the main character to reinvent himself. A game synopsis about whether a jailed protagonist is a victim or a murderer. If he makes good moral choices in prison, he is revealed to have been a victim all along and didn't kill his family. But if he chooses immorally, he is proven to have been guilty all along. The title of that YouTube series is Explained. Expleen equals spleen, symbolism as for fighting off bad cells. A reader pointed out to me this connection. Readers have been stepping up their game the past few months. For 99% of my posts they are 100% me from start to finish, but lately every other post a reader will send in a decode that's equal to the best I make of the week. I hope this trend continues. Though it is worth noting the very end of the video is a clear calm. Exposing to nuclear radiation, exposure, and then a countdown to war. Then trying to hide with a fake identity, and it's failing as he is clearly visible. Symbolism of a ticking clock to a deadline. This ties into another calm I'll be going over shortly from another YouTuber. Today India withdrew their largest bill of 2k rupees. Might this be a deadline for bad actors who would be richest and hold their ill-gotten money in the highest notes? Last time they did something like this. Hours after Trump's surprise election win. Draws a pattern with Durham being just now finished in relation to when Trump got in. Update 4, Creepypasta Countdowns. Markiplier is the most popular YouTube gamer, and so I follow his biggest videos for comms. He became famous through a series of indie horror games about dead children and surveillance cameras. The comms of the MK world, and recently. On YouTube right now there is an indie horror game about old cursed VHS tapes making the rounds. He recently live-streamed this game twice. He waited exactly 10 minutes talking about his broken nose at the intro before starting the game. Nose equals nose comms. Breaking his nose equals symbol of an attack on the secrecy of people tied to the MK ops. In this context, the 10 comm is sometimes used for countdowns. So I thought him waiting that oddly long amount of time might represent the aforementioned countdowns. My suspicion was reinforced when he went in and set the oven for 10. With the context being cursed old VHS tapes, it sounds like a big countdown to war. Comms making the rounds on YouTube at least. The subject matter is presented as an investigation of horrors. Dead plants. Notice the Mouse Hamlin production. A reference to the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a story about a man that can control rats and children. The main character has a Mickey Mouse haircut. Cursed videotapes begin by baking an apple pie, a focus on butchered meat. Which by the way, as an MK victim myself, I can confirm butchered meat is a prominent comm, and the comms of rotted meat was used after the window had closed for me becoming a murderer. I had become dead weight. Anyway, this all sounds like this is a marker for people tied to the MK world ratting. You can see how both this and the video I covered before are acting as markers for the same thing. Going for all endings collection of videotapes. Getting the story of more and more people involved in that world. I said I'd come back to these old VHS tapes. Which means these releases are likely timed to what? Notice the song he plays for the new video. Arcturus. April 30, 2023. New COVID-19 strain Arcturus may cause pink eye, LA Department of Public Health warns. Corona comms being what? April 25, 2023. Amanda the Adventurer release date. April 25, 2023. Moon crash landing of Japanese lander. This gives us context of what was being explored, as the moon can symbolize many types of secret places. That was the Steam release, but originally, April 8, 2022, Amanda the Adventurer original release date. April 8, 2022, Biden 17K mile gaffe. A gaffe comm. This brings us right back to the Corona/Hiroshima comms. September 26, 2020, Joe Biden, I got to the Senate 180 years ago. Plus 180 days equals March 25, 2021. March 25, 2021. Joe Biden, when I came to the U.S. Senate 120 years ago. March 25, 2021, Olympic torch begins its 121-day journey around Japan starting at the nuclear disaster site. Plus 120 days equals July 23, 2021, Japan Olympic torch passing event ends. July 22, 2021, Joe Biden, way back 150 years ago when I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. July 23, 2021, Tokyo Olympics start. Japan is 16 hours ahead of the USA, thus for Japan it was already July 23 when Biden said it. August 8, 2021, Tokyo Olympics end. Plus 180 days equals February 4, 2022. February 4, 2022, China Olympics start. Notice the name. Pratt. I covered that calm in this post. As a symbol tied to the things going on behind the scenes. It all loops around back to the Durham investigation. Remember the countdowns, and it seems to me the YouTube videos I covered are tied to this. This one began inexplicably with him talking for 10 minutes about a broken nose, and then getting into the game. He sets the oven to 10 minutes and then cooks a banana. Symbol potentially of in 10, the pain begins for people who didn't take the chance to flip. This is reinforced by the other YouTube comms I went over. Same day. May 15th. A countdown of that begins with exposing his family to nuclear radiation and ends with war and no privacy. Not just war but Warhammer. I don't expect to see anything overt, but I am going to be on the lookout for comms. I know these comms are silly looking, but that's exactly how such things stay under the radar for so long. Look at the view count of each. 1.5 million for one and 4 million for the other. This is the payment for services in messaging. In exchange for presenting messaging they get to be one of a small handful of people online with millions of viewers regularly. This is how strength is measured. Ability to message. Thankfully it's in service of good now. Comms of warnings about the hammer incoming. That platform furthers the reach of the message, so it all works seamlessly as a payment as well as a method. Anyway. The system is clear now but still have a lot of history to go over to really understand the nuances. In fact, I had a massive history section I didn't include. For the past few weeks I've been uploading my rough drafts to Twitter before I post the final ones here. I didn't include this section, but it will be in a future post. Perhaps one more suitable like civil rights decoding or food comms. I couldn't actually fit it all in the first place, but mostly I chose not to include it as the subject matters are very different. I'd prefer people read my work here as the ones on Twitter are rough drafts, but it's likely a few people would go a long way on Twitter for spreading the message. So if you'd like to, read the rough draft and give it a like/reply or something. It's the same kind of stuff I do here all the time in posts, and you'd be helping me get a little more visibility. Otherwise it'll be posted in a future post with a bit of editing. So might be better to wait. Your call. Telegram chat. Join the Decoding Blog Telegram group. Begin decoding. Send leads. This has been Post Durham, the G7 transition.